Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker. I have waited way too long for Benjamin Banneker. He is an extraordinary American founder. And I'm going to say this right off the bat. He was one of the black patriots who helped found the United States. He was born to two former slaves who themselves had already been freed in Maryland, outside Baltimore. So he was born a free man and grew up a free man. And his life is extraordinary because, and we will get to all this, he essentially proves with his own actions and intelligence that someone's skin color did not matter to the way they were able to think and their level of intelligence. And he very specifically proves it to a very interesting founder, and we are going to get to that. But let's talk about his early life. He lived close to some Quakers, which was fortunate because the Quakers had a little school not far from him where they were open to educate anyone of any skin tone, as you might imagine. Well, I want to say you might imagine, but at the time you might not imagine. But Quakers were very open to this kind of thing. They were very forward-thinking. As we will probably discuss this week when we talk to Jane Calvert again about John Dickinson, though technically not a Quaker. But I digress. Benjamin Banneker, he gets really interested in maths and sciences. And as a teenager, he helps his father on his farm build a new irrigation system. In his early 20s, he receives a pocket watch. Now, I wrote my article. It was a gift. It seems to have been a gift, though I will note I have seen other places that say he borrowed it, but it seems to be a gift to him. And he takes apart this tiny pocket watch and analyzes how it works. And he goes and gets some wood, and he carves out of wood a bunch of gears, and he ends up building a striking clock. Now, a striking clock, I want to call it a grandfather clock. The image next to me, it's an image of him working on it, a later drawn image, and it's essentially a clock that strikes at the same time every day. Usually, especially at the time, it was twice a day, at noon and at midnight it would strike, but, one that strikes every hour. Those are striking clocks. And so he built what is understood to be the first one in America. This may or may not be true, but this is the first one we are absolutely positive was built, and when it was, because he was, I believe, 22 years old, and he built this clock out of wood based off one that he saw. He wasn't taught by a clockmaker. He just opened a pocket watch and then figured out how to turn that into a clock that chimes. And this speaks to his intelligence. And this clock would chime on time for the next 50 years. So he goes on to, he's essentially a farmer, but he gets really interested in astronomy. His neighbors are the Ellicott family, and there are several members of the Ellicott family that I have not written about yet, but were important to the American Revolution. Most notably is Andrew Ellicott, who, Andrew Ellicott, he is the one who went around the United States and finished all our lines. All the states, almost every state on east of the Mississippi has at least part of their line drawn, their borders drawn by Andrew Ellicott. And it was Ellicott and his family lived next door to Banneker, and they promoted his work. They were really friendly with him. And yes, Matt, wooden gears. And it worked for 50 years. And the Ellicotts help him. And in fact, they loan him some astronomy equipment. Just a note on the Ellicott, last week when we talked about the meter and grave from the metric system in France being sent to America, Andrew Ellicott is the one who ended up with the grave, aka the kilogram, the gram, I should say, that came to America. This is how important they were to science and mostly surveying, but they had astronomy equipment, and they loaned it to Benjamin Banneker. And Benjamin Banneker was able to assess the skies and predict a solar eclipse. Now, Banneker, he wants to publish his work, and unfortunately for a black person, that wasn't easy even in Baltimore. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say even in Baltimore, in Maryland at the time. So what he does is he sends his work to Philadelphia to have it verified, and several notable members of the Pennsylvania's elite thinking society, most notably David Rittenhouse, who himself was an extraordinarily important astronomer, not just in America, but to the world in the 1700s. So, with Rittenhouse reviews it, a few other people review it, and they're like, this looks good to me. I don't see anything wrong with this. I don't care what color skin he has. And they talk to the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. And this is in 1791, so just after Franklin dies. But this is the same organization that Benjamin Franklin was associated with, that sent to the first Congress, not a demand, but a request to eliminate slavery from the United States. Obviously, they were the Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. And when David Rittenhouse said, hey, there's this black gentleman down here who has done a fantastic job in astronomy, they were more than happy to help. And they actually helped publish his first almanac. And he would publish his almanac over the next several years. This almanac was different than most almanacs. This one would really focus on the skies and the moons in outer space, as astronomy might. But his almanac demonstrated, and so his almanac ended up being correct when it predicted a solar eclipse. And this demonstrated kind of irreparably that, yeah, a black person could think well. Imagine that. Now, this is interesting because on August 19th, 1791, Benjamin Banneker writes to Thomas Jefferson, the acting Secretary of the State, and famously Thomas Jefferson. Now, he said to Jefferson, he sent him a copy of his almanac, and he essentially said, hey, what's withholding the slaves, bud? And he actually very specifically writes in his letter, he quotes the Declaration and the hypocrisy, and quotes, all men are created equal. And in so many words says, how could you hold slaves and say this? So like when you hear people say that today, like how could someone write the Declaration of Independence and hold slaves? How could they not see the hypocrisy? They saw the hypocrisy. Thomas Jefferson did see this hypocrisy. He was directly confronted with it. In fact, some of the things he wrote that are hard to stomach nowadays, notably his notes in the state of Virginia, which were published in France for France to understand what was happening over in North America. It says some pretty derogatory things about black people. And I have no interest in justifying this, but what Jefferson was trying to do was figure out why. He was not looking at it like, I'm a big racist guy and I'm going to hold people down. He was inquisitive. As Troy is saying, much like Banneker had a scientist's inquisitive mind. Jefferson had this type of mind. Unfortunately, the conclusions Jefferson drew at the time in the 1780s was, well, it must have something to do with not necessarily the color of their skin, but their background being from a different continent, blah, blah, blah. Again, not my idea. Definitely not true. Jefferson was not right about everything. But his mind's, Jefferson and slavery, we're not going to get into it here. His attitudes changed so much over his life, just trying to reason this out. Because this is the same guy who in the 1760s was offering free services to a handful of slaves suing for their freedom. So again, Jefferson's attitudes towards black people and slavery and their abilities changed. But in 1791, when Banneker writes this letter, Jefferson actually writes back. And I have a quote here from Thomas Jefferson I'd like to read that I pulled from Jefferson's response. It's much shorter than Banneker's note, as someone called it. It's more of a memo. But it says, Jefferson says that he too wished, quote, to see a good system commenced for raising the condition of both their body and mind to what it ought to be. And when he says there, he is talking specifically about black people, but at large slaves. And it reflects that he wished to see this, but did Jefferson really believe that it could be done? Well, that's hard to determine. A lot of his writings seem to indicate he thinks it could not be done, but because of the work of Banneker, like legitimate scientific work, confronting Thomas Jefferson right in the face, writing to Banneker. Oh, and by the way, we know about Banneker's letter to Jefferson and Jefferson's letter back, not just because they were good at saving letters, because Banneker published them in his almanac. He published his own letter and Jefferson's response in his almanac. Again, verifying that, yeah, black people can be smart too. Imagine that. Again, that was me being sarcastic, just to be clear. So, yeah, again, I don't want to stick too much. Jefferson's lifetime of contradictions on slavery and hypocrisy, we can save for a later date. But he was, but because of this letter, and the response from Jefferson, the fact that he published it, there are some people who quote Benjamin Banneker as not only being an extraordinary scientist, but being the first civil rights activist in the United States history, who was publicly promoting. There were, of course, you could be argued that the American Revolution was being fought for civil rights. It could be argued that there were certain white people trying to help first, but he was pretty clearly the first black patriot to be fighting for civil rights and the emancipation of slaves in the United States. Now, I want to end on Benjamin Banneker with his death. Seems like a good place to end. He died in 1806 at 76 years old. While they were having his funeral at a different place, somehow his house caught fire. And when his house burned down, sadly we lost most of his belongings. And in that house fire was the clock he built in his early 20s, 50 years earlier. It had still chimed every day of his life from the moment he built it until the day he died, when it also disappeared from history. So that is an extraordinarily brief overview of the life of Benjamin Banneker.